Hello, and welcome to the module on drug legalization. This particular piece by James Wilson argues that many kinds of drugs should not be legalized. In some ways, the argument is unusual. In the companion pro-argument, many of the arguments present in this piece are addressed, so take careful note of potential objections. That said, let's move on. Wilson starts off by noting that during the 1970s, the U.S. government was concerned with the possibility of a heroin epidemic. The author of the piece actually worked with the government at this time. Also about this time, arguments were being made for the legalization of heroin. Two persons of note who made these arguments were the famous psychiatrist Zaz and a Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman. Wilson says that arguments for legalization are typically of two types. The first kinds of argument are moral arguments. These arguments say that the government has no moral right to tell a person what she can or cannot do with her body. Just as the government has no right to tell us what thoughts to put in our head, they have no right to tell us what substances to put in our bodies. Some of these arguments go even further by pointing out that mind-altering substances change our thoughts, and so by regulating what substances we can put into our bodies, the government is in some sense regulating what kinds of thoughts we can have. The other kind of argument for legalization is economic. This was Friedman's primary focus. The claims made by these arguments are that the benefits of the war on drugs, or on a particular type of drug, do not outweigh the cost of keeping it illegal. Costs can be financial costs, but also social costs and costs in terms of lost opportunity. From our past modules, you might recognize the first type of argument as one dealing with principles, and perhaps even more Kantian in nature, though it certainly doesn't have to be compatible with Kant, but it is more along those lines. And the other type of argument is being consequentialist, and depending on how it is made, perhaps compatible with utilitarianism. Utilitarians would care about costs in terms of suffering. In terms of economics, they would care about how money could be spent to alleviate suffering, or, in some cases, how it might end up being spent to make suffering worse. Wilson points out that today, by which he is referring to 1990, the time he wrote the paper, there are roughly the same number of heroin addicts as there were in the 1970s. So what happened to the predicted heroin epidemic? Wilson thinks that the fact that the heroin epidemic didn't occur is worthy of notice and examination. In other words, the fact that the number of heroin addicts remained roughly the same means that the predicted epidemic did not occur, and Wilson thinks that it is worth asking why it didn't occur. His belief is that the heroin epidemic didn't occur because we kept heroin illegal. During the intervening time, he says, a number of things came to pass. Overall, there came to be fewer new heroin users. Some evidence for this was the fact that those admitted to hospitals for heroin-related conditions went from an average age of being in their 20s to an average age of being in their 30s. This indicates that heroin was gaining fewer new recruits, and that therefore the population of users was getting older. Also, heroin use in many inner-city areas dropped. For example, heroin use in Harlem dropped from 8% to 3%, and when potential users were asked why they chose not to use heroin, they gave three main reasons. First, costs were too high. The street price rose a great deal from 1973 to 1975. Second, they listed trouble with the law. And third, they listed health problems. If we look at these reasons, costs were too high, trouble with the law, and health problems, Wilson thinks that we can see that they are all tied to law enforcement. That's to say, keeping heroin illegal. Why is this? Well, trouble with the law is of course clearly a result of law enforcement. By keeping heroin illegal and enforcing these laws, anybody who used, purchased, or sold the drug would risk severe penalties. But how about the other two problems? The street cost of drugs being tied to law enforcement might seem less obvious on the surface, but Wilson believes that this is tied to law enforcement too. This is because the more drugs that are confiscated during drug busts, the less supply there is. Then the law of supply and demand kicks in. With the same demand and less supply, prices rise. In addition, prices may rise because of increased risk to smugglers and dealers who need bigger potential gains as incentives to take the risk associated with smuggling or dealing drugs. Drug dealers deal drugs not because they love the drug trade, but because they want to make money. If the risk and rewards for another business look better to them, They will therefore move on to something else. The least obvious connection is the third issue, health problems, but Wilson believes that this too can be tied to law enforcement and the illegality of drugs. If heroin were legal, presumably clean needles would be legal to purchase. But sharing and reusing dirty needles is a primary cause of disease for heroin users. Likewise, illegal trade in heroin would reduce the likelihood of the drug being cut with a poison or of it having a purity that the user is unaware of. This greatly reduces the chance of an overdose. With heroin, users build up a physical tolerance to the drug. Addicts regularly take in many times the amount of the drug that would have killed a person who had never used the drug before. The difference of a few grams can mean life or death. So imagine a user from a source that has been selling 50% pure heroin, then running across a batch that is 75% pure. If this user injects the same apparent volume of the drug within the syringe that she or he is used to, she or he is now getting 50% more heroin. That might easily kill him or her. And of course, another major health issue is what impure ingredients heroin might be cut with. If the drug were legal, then manufacturers would have to cut the drug with safe substances. But on the black market, dealers cut the drugs with whatever they have handy and whatever they believe will pass for the drug. They are not very likely to consider the long-term health effects that these substances will have on their customers. Another group of concern leading the government and others to worry about a heroin epidemic were veterans returning home from Vietnam. Many of these veterans were addicted to heroin. The fear was that this large influx of heroin users back into the United States would spark off an epidemic of heroin use. This would increase demand, make trading the drug more profitable, more people would begin to smuggle it, and availability would increase. Along with increased availability would be new recruits to the drug. But this heroin epidemic didn't come even once the veterans returned home. Wilson believes that this is because heroin was kept illegal, which led to the consequences of health and trouble with the law that we mentioned earlier. But it also led to other consequences. For example, veterans returning home, if they wanted to obtain the drug, would find it much more difficult to do so. They would have to drive to large cities, they would have to make shady contacts, and of course they would have to use the drug in secret. Take special note of what Wilson has to say about the Vietnam veterans because Shapiro uses them as an example in his pro-legalization paper as well. Wilson says that currently, and remember that when he says currently we mean 1990, there are roughly 500,000 heroin users. He also points out that this is roughly the same number we had in the 70s. For those who are interested, a little bit of quick research shows that in 2012, the National Institute on Drug Abuse gives the estimate of 669,000 heroin users. The number has been climbing recently, but very, very slowly. Wilson also points out that in England, where it was partially legalized, they did have a heroin epidemic. In England, it was partially legalized in the sense that doctors could prescribe it with little control. It is worth taking a moment here to consider the effects of heroin and its side effects. Note, we are setting aside the dangers that do not come from the drug itself, such as overdose, dirty needles, harmful substances it may be cut with, and trouble with the law. After all, overdoses or poisons or trouble with the law could exist for nearly any drug that was made illegal. Instead, we are just asking what the effects of the drug heroin itself are. The primary effect of heroin is the drowsy euphoria it causes. This is the sensation for which people take the drug in the first place. But what are the major negative side effects of the drug? These are constipation and sexual side effects, such as difficulty becoming aroused and so forth. Also, it may be worth noting withdrawal symptoms. But it is also important to note that this is not a side effect of the drug, it is a side effect of ceasing to take the drug. The withdrawal symptoms of heroin are said to be about as bad as going through a severe flu that lasts for about 2 weeks. We will talk about this more in Shapiro's paper. Given this, we can see that many common antidepressants and maybe even over-the-counter drugs have more serious side effects than heroin. Indeed, opiates like heroin are in general much less toxic than drugs like alcohol when considered just on their own. Wilson asks us then to consider what would have happened if we would have followed Friedman's advice and legalized heroin. He says heroin would have become 95% cheaper, that there would not be a risk of it being cut with poisons, that users would have sterile needles, that people would not have to travel far to get heroin, and that there would really be few financial or health reasons not to do heroin. Notice that Wilson is saying that these would be bad consequences. This is because there would be more heroin users. This means that heroin use for Wilson is bad for reasons other than medical or financial harm that it does to its users. We will see more about this later. Now, this might seem like a counterintuitive argument. After all, many of the reasons listed above are reasons people often give for legalizing drugs. If drugs are cheaper, it is often argued that that means that there would be less crime because people would not be stealing to support their habit. It would also mean that people do not as often ruin themselves financially to support their addictions. People are often severely addicted to tobacco and alcohol, for example, but these things do not often lead to financial ruin, at least not just to pay for the drugs, even with heavy taxes, because as legal products, they can be cheaply mass-produced. Also, health risks are a primary reason why many people think that drugs are bad to begin with. So Wilson's argument might seem counterintuitive. Indeed, many people might argue, even if there are twice as many users of heroin, it is worth it if there are only, say, 1/30th as many deaths, or some such. But this is not Wilson's position. For Wilson, saving lives in this way would actually be a bad thing because it would mean that there would be more heroin users. So what is at the heart of Wilson's objection? While Wilson does spend some time in his paper arguing that using drugs has negative consequences on one's life, I think that what comes out here shows that the heart of his objection is really the fact that he thinks that certain kinds of drug use is wrong in itself. Even if heroin could be made such that it would cause no deaths or diseases, Wilson would still object to it. Indeed, from the argument on the previous page, we can see that he would find removing the death and diseases to be a bad thing because he thinks it would lead to more drug use. But why does he think that heroin is such an evil drug while there are drugs like tobacco around which are far more dangerous? Wilson objects specifically to drugs that change a person's fundamental character or personality. His objection is summed up in one line nicely, where he says tobacco shortens life, cocaine, and presumably heroin, debases it. He says cocaine here because this comes in the later part of the piece where he is dealing with the issue of legalizing cocaine and not the part of the piece where he is talking about heroin. So Wilson is concerned about the question coming up at the time he was writing the paper, the question of legalizing cocaine and crack. He asks if these drugs should be legalized. Well, Wilson says that if it would have been unwise to legalize heroin, then it is certainly unwise to legalize cocaine and crack. While heroin tends to cause one to be sleepy and has relatively mild side effects, crack causes, according to Wilson, much more intense euphoria and desire to repeat, mood swings, violence. In fact, Wilson even includes homicide as an effect of the drug. Crack does much more damage to a fetus if a pregnant woman uses it, and also pregnant women are much more likely to use it than heroin. The phrase victimless crime often refers to consensual crimes, things that are illegal but where all involved parties are consensual and capable of giving consent. In other words, not children or drunk people and so forth. And also who are not forced into consenting. Examples of crimes often held to be consensual crimes are prostitution, gambling, homosexual behavior, which was illegal until relatively recently, other alternative but consensual lifestyles, and also drug use. These are called victimless crimes because, if they are illegal, the claim is that there is no victim of the crime since all parties consent. For example, if two people freely bet on a football game, the argument is that there is no victim because each party did what he or she wanted to do. Drug use is often called a victimless crime. Wilson disagrees with this characterization and claims that the victims of drug use are families that are neglected, employers that end up with poor employees, and employees that have to work harder or are in danger because of drugged co-workers. He says, we all have a stake in ensuring that each of us displays at least a minimum level of dignity, responsibility, and empathy. With the words dignity and empathy here, you can again see that Wilson is concerned with more than just the consequences of drug use. One thing to consider here is whether Wilson is right about his list of people being victims of drug use, or whether or not he is listing people who are victims of other separate offenses, such as negligence or operating machinery while intoxicated, which is arguably a separate issue, or other unethical behavior that is wrong to engage in, whether somebody does it because of drug use, or because they have a hobby that they spend all night with, or some other perfectly legal obsession in their lives. But what about the status of the war on drugs? People note that both heroin and cocaine use still exist. So does that mean we have lost the war on drugs? Wilson says no. He says that we haven't won the war on drugs either. What he says we have done by keeping drugs illegal, he believes, is prevent drug use from reaching epidemic levels. There are a couple additional benefits Wilson believes exist for keeping drugs illegal. First are compulsory drug programs. Wilson cites a study that patients under mandatory compulsion stay in programs longer than those who are not. He questions how compulsion could be achieved if drug use were legal, however. But it is not clear that he is right about this. After all, alcohol use is legal, but there are often compulsory alcohol treatment programs for those who wish to avoid jail time. One can clearly have mandatory treatment programs for otherwise legal activities when part of what landed somebody in jail is abuse of those legal activities. Wilson also sees a benefit for drug education. He suggests that drug education programs would lose credibility for those drugs that are legalized. Because unlike tobacco, cocaine will not give one cancer, Wilson wonders what will dissuade children from using it if they believe that it will give them pleasure. He does not think that the fact that it causes people to neglect their family, job, and so forth would have as much force in dissuading them as illegality would. He does not deny, however, that if drugs are illegal, we could still educate people not to use them, and this is a potential weakness. After all, tobacco is legal and we educate people not to use it. Such education has become increasingly effective in recent years, although as noted, Wilson doubts education against cocaine would be as effective because cocaine does not carry the same direct health risk as tobacco. But note that we also try to educate people regarding safe sex, safe driving habits, good eating habits, exercise, good study habits, and so forth, and the negation of these things are illegal. It might be pleasurable to blow off studying every day and party instead, but most children are educated to the point that they are able to consider their long-term interests and not just their short-term ones. Also, just because a drug is legal for adults to use does not mean that it would be legal for children to use. Few people arguing for drug legalization argue that those under age limits such as 21 or 18 should be allowed to partake. Finally, Wilson notes that alcohol is in fact a very dangerous drug, but says that just because one dangerous thing is legal isn't a good reason to allow another one to be legal too. He says that trying to make alcohol illegal was doomed to failure because alcohol was already such a large part of our culture, indeed most world cultures, and is in such wide use. So he doesn't advocate prohibition of alcohol for practical reasons. But he asks us to do a thought experiment. He asks us to imagine that instead of alcohol being in common use as it is now, it is instead a new drug currently being used by about 500,000 people. He also asks us to imagine that we know everything about alcohol that we know now. We know that if legalized, there would be thousands of drunk driving accidents, increased domestic abuse, incidents of alcohol poisoning, families being torn apart by alcoholism, and so forth. He asks, if we knew about alcohol what we know now, and if only 500,000 people used it, should we legalize it then? If it wasn't such a large part of the culture as it is today, but instead was in the same position as heroin, and he believes can be controlled by keeping it illegal, would it be wise to make alcohol legal knowing what we know now? He says that at the very least, the answer isn't a clear yes and deserves serious consideration. And that ends this presentation. Again, try to remember the arguments given here because many of them will come up in one way or another in Shapiro's pro-legalization piece. Until next time.